Tilly Morgan arrived home just after sunset, worn down by another exhausting day at work. She stepped inside, dropped her purse near the door, and called toward the hallway. "Marv? I'm home." "Nothing." She paused. That was unusual. Marv always answered, even if his attention was buried in a television program or his phone. Sometimes it was nothing more than a distracted hey, but he always let her know he'd heard her. A strange uneasiness settled over her. "Marv." Still nothing. Assuming he was asleep, Tilly walked toward the bedroom. She was already thinking about changing into something comfortable when she pushed open the door, and stopped dead. Her husband was lying across the bed. But that wasn't what shocked her. Marv was wearing a red dress. His face was carefully made up, his hair styled, and his appearance was so deliberately feminine that Tilly could only stand there in stunned silence. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then disbelief turned into irritation. Tilly marched to the bed and pulled the blanket away. "Marv." He stirred. "Wake up." His eyes opened slowly. Then he saw her. His expression changed instantly. Panic. "Tilly, What is this?" Marv pushed himself upright, desperately searching for an explanation that wouldn't sound ridiculous. "I can explain." "Then explain." He swallowed. "The makeup. I did it myself." Tilly stared at him. That wasn't exactly the part one was asking about. Marv lowered his eyes. Tilly pointed toward the door. "Get up and come to the dining room." "I should probably change first." "No." He looked at her. "You've already been seen," she said firmly. "So leave everything exactly as it is." A few minutes later, Marv entered the dining room, the soft clicking of his heels announcing his arrival before he even appeared. Tilly was waiting at the table. "Sit down." Marv obeyed. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to talk. What followed was a confession he had spent most of his adult life avoiding. He told her about being a child and secretly slipping into his older sister's dresses whenever no one was home. At first, he'd thought of it as nothing more than curiosity. But the feeling had returned again and again until dressing up became something he secretly anticipated. Eventually, his sister discovered him. Marv had expected embarrassment, anger, perhaps punishment. Instead, she encouraged him. Sometimes she even told him to dress up when their parents were away. Later, their mother discovered the secret too. What began as discipline gradually became something much more complicated, leaving Marv with memories he had never quite figured out how to understand. Years went by. His sister moved away. Marv grew older. He married Tilly. For a long time, he tried to bury that part of himself. He convinced himself that it had disappeared. It hadn't. Eventually, he began buying things again, carefully and secretly. Dresses. Shoes. Makeup. Lingerie. He traveled to shops far enough from town that he wouldn't recognize anyone he knew, then hid everything in places he was certain Tilly would never search. When he finished speaking, the dining room became completely silent. Tilly leaned back in her chair. "How much do you have?" Marv hesitated. "Marv." "More than a few things." "How much?" He finally admitted the truth. "Several dresses. Multiple pairs of heels. Lingerie. Cosmetics. Enough clothing to occupy a substantial section of the spare room closet." Tilly raised an eyebrow. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Your makeup is actually pretty good." Marv looked up. "What?" "You heard me." He didn't know how to respond. Tilly studied his face. "You've clearly been doing this for a long time." The amusement disappeared from her expression. "Now we're going to talk about what happens next." Marv's stomach tightened. Tilly folded her arms. "At the moment, I'm the only person earning money in this house." He nodded cautiously. "So if you're staying home, you're going to take responsibility for the household." "What does that mean?" "It means everything." Marv blinked. "Everything?" "Cooking. Cleaning. Laundry. Grocery shopping. Errands. All of it." He opened his mouth but couldn't think of an argument. Tilly continued. "And there's something else." Marv waited. "If this is important enough for you to hide all these years, then maybe it's time you stop treating it like something you have to sneak around with." He looked at her carefully. What are you saying? I'm saying you don't have to keep pretending this part of you doesn't exist. Marv stared at her. Then Tilly added, the men's clothes can go. His eyes widened. Tilly, wait. I'll decide what happens to them. She held his gaze. Fine. But answer one question first. Marv's heart began pounding. Are you staying? He looked down at the table. Or are you leaving? The question hung between them. Finally, he exhaled. I'm staying. A small smile appeared on Tilly's face. Marv relaxed slightly. But don't you think this is going a little too far? He asked. I've never hurt anyone. I've never even left the house dressed like this. Tilly laughed softly. Maybe that's exactly the problem. What do you mean? Maybe you've spent too long hiding. Marv didn't answer. Maybe, she continued, it's time for an adventure. The word did little to comfort him. Instead, it brought back an old, familiar feeling, the same uncertainty he'd experienced when his sister first discovered his secret. The same uneasiness he'd felt when his mother had taken control of the situation. Once again, someone else seemed to be deciding where his life was headed. And once again, Marv had no idea where that road would end. The next morning, Marv woke before sunrise. He slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb Tilly, and began getting dressed. He had barely finished when he heard movement behind him. Tilly was awake. She opened one eye. For a moment, she simply watched him. Then she smiled. Starting early. Marv gave her a nervous look. Tilly remained silent as he continued getting ready. She couldn't help noticing how effortlessly he moved. There was no awkwardness or hesitation. He knew exactly what he was doing. The realization surprised her. He hadn't simply started doing this yesterday. This had been part of him for years. When Marv left the bedroom to decide what to wear for the day, Tilly found herself thinking about it more than she expected. By the time she reached the kitchen, coffee was already waiting. Marv was arranging breakfast. Tilly sat down and poured herself a cup. Your schedule today is straightforward. She placed some cash on the table. Clean the house from top to bottom. Then go grocery shopping. Marv nodded. Tilly took a sip of coffee. And there's a nail salon beside the market. Marv looked up. Why? Because you're going there. He blinked. For what? A manicure. Tilly. With polish. He stared at her. She stared back. Eventually, Marv sighed. What color? You're the one getting it. He thought about that. I don't know. Then let them choose. Marv nodded reluctantly. Before leaving for work, Tilly stopped at the door. And Marv? Yes. When I come home, I expect this house to be spotless. A faint smile appeared on his face. I think you'll be impressed. She left. And Marv got to work. He started in the living room, dusting every shelf, polishing every surface, and putting everything back into perfect order. Then he moved to the bedroom. Fresh sheets. Clean floors. Organized drawers. After that came the bathrooms, which he scrubbed until they looked almost new. Hours passed. To his surprise, Marv didn't resent any of it. In fact, he enjoyed it. There was something strangely satisfying about transforming a messy room into a clean one and seeing the results immediately. By early afternoon, the house was immaculate. Then came the difficult part. Going outside. Marv stood near the front door for several minutes. He imagined people staring, whispering, laughing, judging him. Finally, he took a breath and stepped outside. At the grocery store, something unexpected happened. Nothing. People walked past him without giving him a second glance. A few shoppers smiled politely. Most didn't seem to care at all. When he reached the checkout, the cashier handed him his receipt. Have a wonderful afternoon. Marv froze for half a second. The words caught him completely off guard. He walked away feeling strangely light. At the nail salon, the experience was even easier than he'd imagined. The staff welcomed him without hesitation. He sat down, relaxed, and let someone else take care of the details. When the technician asked what color he wanted, Marv stared at the selection. I can't decide. The technician smiled. Then I'll choose. A little while later, Marv looked down at his hands. Deep red. Elegant. Bold. He couldn't stop staring. On the way home, he kept glancing at his nails. For the first time, he realized that the experience hadn't embarrassed him. He'd actually enjoyed it. That evening, he prepared dinner. By the time Tilly came home, the house was immaculate and dinner was waiting. She stepped inside and immediately noticed. Her eyes moved from room to room. She inspected the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom. Finally, she found Marv relaxing on the couch. How did you do all this in one day? Marv smiled. Trade secret. Tilly laughed. At dinner, her eyes eventually landed on his hands. The manicure looks good. Marv looked down. I liked it. I thought you might. He smiled. Honestly, I think I'd go back. Tilly shook her head. Of course you would. Marv looked at her. And if you're going to get manicures, she added, you're going to wear polish. He laughed. Is that another rule? Absolutely. There was no point arguing. They continued eating. Tilly took another bite of the roast and looked up. This is excellent. Glad you approve. Then something seemed to occur to her. What about the boxes? Marv's smile disappeared. My old clothes. Yes. They are packed. Good. Marv hesitated. Tilly, maybe don't throw them away yet. She looked at him. We'll see. Later that evening, Marv carried the boxes outside and placed them in the trunk of Tilly's car. He stood there for a moment, watching them disappear from sight. It felt more significant than he expected. As if an old version of his life was being packed away, not necessarily destroyed, but no longer in control of him. When he returned inside, the house was quiet. For the first time in years, Marv didn't feel like he was simply hiding a secret. He felt as though something had changed. Something he couldn't quite name yet. That night, he filled the bathtub with warm water and poured in a generous amount of bubble bath. Then he lowered himself into the water, rested his head against the edge, and stared thoughtfully at his freshly polished nails. Tomorrow would bring another day. And, judging by Tilly, probably another surprise. Marv smiled to himself. Whatever happened next, he suspected his life was never going to be quite the same again. The warm bath did more than wash away the day's exhaustion. As Marv sank beneath the fragrant water, he felt the tension gradually leave his body. For the first time all day, there was nothing demanding his attention. No chores. No errands. No expectations. Just quiet. While he soaked, he decided to take care of a few other things he'd been neglecting. By the time he finally stepped out of the tub, he felt as though he'd hit a reset button. He was calmer. Lighter. Almost renewed. Can you help me with something? He called. Tilly appeared a moment later. There were a few places Marv couldn't quite reach on his own, and she helped him without making a fuss. When everything was finished, she stepped back and looked him over from head to toe. An amused smile crossed her face. You certainly don't believe in doing anything halfway, do you? Marv laughed. Apparently not. The next morning brought another unexpected outing. Marv went into town and stopped at a shoe shop. After browsing for a while, he settled on a pair of simple black flats decorated with tiny bows. They were comfortable enough for everyday use but still had a little personality. From there, he visited a clothing store. He found a soft skirt and a matching sweater, then added a comfortable nightgown to his purchases. When he returned home, he couldn't resist trying everything on immediately. He stood in front of the mirror. For a long moment, he simply looked at himself. Then he smiled. He had expected to feel nervous. Instead, he liked what he saw. Later that morning, while hanging freshly washed clothes in the backyard, he heard a voice from the neighboring property. Good morning. Marv turned. An older woman stood by the fence, smiling at him. It was Mrs. Jacobson. For a brief second, she looked puzzled. Then she laughed. I thought you were Marv. Marv couldn't help smiling. The wig probably gave me away. Oh, definitely. Her eyes moved over his outfit. I love that sweater. Thank you. And your makeup is lovely. Marv raised an eyebrow. I've had a lot of practice. Mrs. Jacobson laughed. I can tell. The conversation continued far more naturally than Marv had expected. She complimented his shoes, asked where he'd found them, and chatted about the neighborhood as if nothing about the situation were unusual. There was no uncomfortable silence. No judgment. No awkward questions. Before they parted, Mrs. Jacobson invited him over for coffee the next morning. Marv was surprised by the invitation. Even more surprising was how ordinary the whole conversation had felt. A few weeks earlier, he never would have imagined himself standing in the backyard, chatting casually with a neighbor while dressed this way. Now it seemed almost normal. That evening, after another successful dinner, Tilly sat across from him at the table. She had a thoughtful look on her face. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever thought about having a feminine name?" Marv paused. "A name?" Tilly nodded. He shook his head. "Not really." Tilly considered that for a moment. Then she smiled. "When I was younger, there was a girl I always admired." Marv waited. "Mary Beth." The name seemed to linger between them. Tilly tilted her head. "What do you think?" Marv repeated it quietly. "Mary Beth." He thought about it. Then nodded. "I like it." "Good." Tilly lifted her glass. "To Mary Beth." Marv raised his own. "To Mary Beth." Later, he mentioned his invitation to Florence Jacobson's house. Tilly immediately laughed. Marv looked suspiciously at her. "What?" "Just be careful." "Careful of what?" "Florence has a reputation." "For what?" Tilly's grin widened. "For being quite the charmer." Marv laughed. "I think I can survive 1 cup of coffee." "We'll see." "I promise I'll behave." Tilly shook her head. "That's exactly what someone who won't behave would say." The following morning, Marv arrived at Florence Jacobson's house expecting a quiet visit. He was completely unprepared for what he found. Several women were gathered around the dining table, talking over one another, laughing, and enjoying coffee. Marv stopped in the doorway. Florence spotted him immediately. "There she is." The women turned. Marv felt his nerves return. But only for a moment. The group welcomed him as though he'd been attending for years. Soon, questions began flying. Where did he get his makeup? How did he make his eyeliner so precise? How did he choose his clothes? What products did he use? Instead of feeling interrogated, Marv found himself enjoying the attention. Before long, he was demonstrating a few makeup techniques. The women watched with genuine curiosity. One asked him to show her how he shaped his eyeliner. Another wanted to know how he matched foundation. Marv laughed throughout the entire demonstration. The morning disappeared almost without him noticing. Eventually, the last guest left. Florence poured herself another cup of coffee and leaned back in her chair. "You know," she said, "you fit in remarkably well." Marv smiled. "Honestly, I'm surprised nobody seemed to notice." Florence raised an eyebrow. "Notice what?" Marv hesitated. "That I'm a man." Florence's smile grew wider. "Oh, they noticed." Marv stared at her. "You told them?" "Of course." "And nobody cared?" "Why would they?" She reached across the table and gave his hand a gentle pat. "You're pleasant company. You're kind. You know how to hold a conversation." She shrugged. "That's what matters." Then she pointed at him. "And just so we're clear, these coffee mornings are now part of your schedule." Marv laughed. "Is that an invitation?" Florence smiled. "It's a little bit of an invitation and a little bit of an order." Before long, life settled into a new routine. Most mornings began with coffee at Florence's house. There were conversations, laughter, neighborhood stories, and occasional discussions about clothes and makeup. The afternoons belonged to the household. Cleaning, shopping, cooking, laundry, errands. For the first time in years, Marv felt something he hadn't expected to find. Contentment. He wasn't constantly hiding. He wasn't constantly worrying about being discovered. He had a routine. People around him knew who he was. And, surprisingly, most of them simply didn't care. Tilly seemed to notice the change in him too. Rather than discouraging his growing confidence, she encouraged it in her own way. A few weeks later, she surprised him with an appointment at a professional beauty salon. Marv was nervous when he arrived. He was even more nervous when the stylist began working. But as the hours passed, his anxiety slowly disappeared. His hair was shaped into soft curls. His eyebrows were carefully groomed. His makeup was professionally selected and applied to complement his features. Finally, the stylist turned the chair toward the mirror. Marv stared. He barely recognized the person looking back. The reflection was polished, elegant, confident. For once, he didn't see someone trying to hide. He saw someone who looked comfortable in their own skin. Tilly absolutely loved the result. That evening, she announced that they were going out to celebrate. After carefully selecting an outfit, they headed to a local supper club. For a while, everything was wonderful. They ate. They laughed. Marv felt relaxed. Then he saw someone he recognized. Charlie. An old co-worker. Marv's stomach tightened. Charlie approached their table. At first, it was nothing more than a few rude remarks. Marv tried to ignore him. But Charlie kept going. The situation became increasingly hostile. Before Marv could fully react, Charlie suddenly swung at him. The punch caught him hard. Marv stumbled backward and crashed into the side of the bar. Pain shot through his arm. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Staff members rushed over. Someone called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived and took control of the situation. Charlie was arrested. Marv was taken to the hospital. The doctors quickly confirmed what he had already feared. His arm was broken. Despite the circumstances, the medical staff treated him with complete professionalism. No staring. No intrusive questions. No judgment. While helping him change into a hospital gown, one of the nurses even complimented the elegant slip he'd been wearing beneath his clothes. The simple comment caught Marv off guard. It was such an ordinary moment in the middle of such an extraordinary night. When Tilly arrived, however, there was nothing ordinary about her expression. She looked terrified. The sight of Marv injured had clearly shaken her. After the doctors finished their examination, a police officer returned to speak with them. He explained that Charlie would likely face serious legal consequences. Will he actually be charged? Marv asked. Yes, the officer said. The broken arm makes this a much more serious matter. He explained that Charlie could potentially be held responsible for medical expenses and other damages, depending on how the case developed. Once the officer left, the doctor secured Marv's cast and gave him instructions for follow-up care. Eventually, they went home. Tilly prepared a simple meal while Marv sat at the kitchen table, his injured arm resting carefully beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Then Marv broke the silence. You know, Charlie was always difficult. Tilly looked up. Difficult. He liked intimidating people. Verbally. Mostly. Marv looked down at his cast. Everyone at work knew he was a loudmouth. He enjoyed making people uncomfortable. Tilly frowned. Did you ever think he'd do something like this? No. Marv sighed. I expected an insult. Maybe an argument. He glanced at his arm. Not this. Tilly remained quiet. Maybe he'd been drinking, Marv added. Maybe. There were times when he'd lose his temper and apologize later. Marv shook his head. But there are people like that everywhere. Tilly reached across the table and gently took his hand. I don't ever want to see you hurt like this again. Her voice was quiet. Marv looked at her. Tilly took a breath. Would you consider wearing your old clothes when you're out in public? Marv's expression changed. He understood immediately why she was asking. You know how much I enjoy dressing this way. I know. And you asking me to stop? No. Her expression softened. I'm not asking you to give it up. Marv listened. Wear whatever you want at home. Wear it with Florence. Go to your coffee gatherings. Enjoy yourself. She squeezed his hand. I'm only asking you to be more cautious when you're out in public. Marv looked down. The request wasn't coming from embarrassment. It was coming from fear. Tilly wasn't ashamed of him. She was afraid of losing him. After a long silence, Marv nodded. That seems fair. Relief crossed Tilly's face. Then she glanced at his newly styled hair. What about the curls? Marv laughed. I suppose I'll have to visit the salon tomorrow. You don't have to. I know. He smiled. But if changing my hair makes you feel safer, then I don't mind. Tilly reached across the table again. Thank you. Marv squeezed her hand. You're only asking because you care. I do care. I know. She smiled. I love you. The words settled between them without awkwardness. Marv smiled back. I love you too. In the days that followed, neither of them got everything they wanted. Marv still had to make compromises. Tilly still had to confront her fears. But somewhere between those two realities, they found something far more valuable than either of them had expected. Understanding. They learned that love wasn't always about getting your way. Sometimes it meant protecting someone without trying to control them. Sometimes it meant asking for compromise without demanding surrender. And sometimes, the strongest relationships were built in the space between two people who chose to meet each other halfway. For Marv and Tilly, that middle ground wasn't perfect. But it was theirs. And, for the moment, that was enough.